Hi, everyone. Miki Demeter here. I'm really just excited to open up this conference here. This has just been amazing to be asked to come and do a keynote. I wanted to do something extra special because, as everybody knows, 2020 has been kind of a really odd year as years go. I mean, when you have a pandemic and when you have, murder hornets and things of that nature, I don't think that any single one movie writer could ever come up with a script like this. But that's really the way it is. I mean, there's just no way to do it justice. But I do want to give you a content and trigger warning. I will be talking about police brutality, some transphobic terms, and sex work. And so I'll be covering a little bit about each of these, and I just want to make sure that nobody is triggered. I'm not really sure when pronouns and introductions came to be, but in my world, it was one of those things that was kind of a blessing and a curse. The funny thing is no one really knows when this actually became the norm. I mean, at first I really liked it because when I first started to transition for the third time in my life, people no longer misgendered me because I was able to give them my pronouns. But then I see friends who have decided not to physically or medically transition. And this is kind of where the curse part comes in. And that is when you do not meet the societal physical norms for the gender identity that you identify as. And so when you do give them your pronouns and they look at you with this really, raised eyebrow look and give you that look like, really, are you kidding me? I can't tell you how many times I have seen that look. It really shouldn't bother me. It's the way things are, it's the way people are, but it really does bother me. I mean, deep down inside, it's still very disrespectful, I believe. The nice thing is that today I pass well enough that I'm only misgendered basically on the phone. And most people are really very aware of presentation and that it may be deceiving. So most people I know really do try. It's really funny because you'll find that this is mostly on an age basis, and you have certain age categories where you have Gen Z who has grown up with this their whole life with no issue with it. You have the millennials who have some kind of, set ideas, and then you have the boomers who just, kind of come unglued at the idea of using different pronouns for people. But there is a huge difference between those that try versus those that completely ignore people's feelings. So I'm going to tell you a little bit of a story about myself. This was kind of a lesson in humility. I have grown up my entire life with this, idea of being, gender nonconforming. And yet, even me, I was able to make a mistake that was unconscionable. And this was at work when I accidentally outed a coworker. Now, Dave came out to me at Pride about 4 years ago. And he told me he was I was the first one that he had come out to, and that he was thinking of transitioning from male to female. And this was great because I'd known him for a long time, and I actually had no idea. Well, over the year, because we worked in the same group, it was becoming increasingly difficult to try to keep the two separated, because when we were separate and not working around places, he wanted to use female pronouns and his chosen name of Jamie. However, while we were at work and around people, he wanted me to use he pronouns and his original name Dave because he wasn't ready to come out at work. Well, one day I kind of blew that for him, as I was talking to somebody on our team, and I used his chosen female name. And the person looked at me and they realized who I was talking about, and I just was horrified. I accidentally outed him in a way that shouldn't happen to anybody. However, as bad as I felt, he was angry with me for some time, and rightfully so. But eventually he did come back, and we ended up being friends again. But the reason I tell you this story is everybody is going to make mistakes. And the thing that's really difficult about this is that when you do, when you are given somebody's pronouns and they don't match their societal norms, people are very visual. And so sometimes it's easy to make mistakes. And the thing is to admit the mistake, make the change, and move on. Now, the thing about Jamie that made it even harder was that Jamie decided to detransition, and so returned to being Dave. And that made it all the more difficult for me, because now I had gone through this change of calling him Dave, calling him Jamie, and now calling him Dave again. But as I say, it's his choice, not mine. So it's up to me to make sure that I follow what he is asking for. But, over and above that, how many people here have problems with pronouns? A lot of people do. How many of you ever make mistakes? I know I make mistakes from time to time. But one of the things that is the hardest thing to get over for so many people, and mind you, this is just anecdotal evidence, right? And that is the most hated pronoun, which is they, them. However, this has been used in the singular form since the 16th century, so it isn't anything new by any means. And I always tell people that if you truly cannot get over the plural argument, which is what all of the grammar people keep getting on you for, is, this is a plural, it doesn't stand for, singular. Well, I try to explain to them that if you think of a non-binary person, that they don't identify as either one of the binary genders, but somewhere on a fluidic spectrum. So consider that they have a plurality of genders, and then they, them actually fits the bill. I'm not sure how this happened or when it really happened, but the one event that always is in everyone's mind is in March of 2016, when HB 2, also known as House Bill 2, was passed in North Carolina. Suddenly, the issue of transgender people using a bathroom, matching their identified gender, comes to the forefront of everyone's daily news. How did this happen, I ask? Better yet, why did it happen at all? Across America, with one single event, trans people were thrust into the spotlight of daily news stories. Slogans were created: flush discrimination, y'all means y'all, no men in women's bathrooms. All of these slogans were developed and weaponized by both sides. To what end? This has been around for many, many years. It is nothing new. And yet it was decided that it needed to be a political issue with no consideration for anyone. Just talking points to inflame the masses on each side. Still, even today, the Supreme Court questioning on landmark cases for LGBTQ discrimination always centers around bathrooms and locker rooms. To show how bad this still is, a very close friend of mine was on her sabbatical and traveling cross country. She stopped in Atlantic City, and she was staying at one of the large casinos. She doesn't present well as her chosen gender, and she's very comfortable with herself, and she's fine with it. She is living her life in the way that she wants to. However, she went into one of the women's restrooms, and they sent in 2 armed guards to take her out. While she was trying to video what they were doing to her, they took her phone and broke it. They drug her out, they removed her from the restroom, told her she should have been dressed more like a woman, and then after sitting her and questioning her for almost an hour, asked her to leave and didn't even bother to refund her money. So it shows you that people everywhere still treat trans people with disdain, and that's very, very unfortunate. And this is where House Bill 2 is probably one of the most recent LGBTQ issues that was fought by the people, where the big corporations and everything put North Carolina on notice that if they kept that bill, they were going to start pulling things out of North Carolina, which they did, right down to the NCAA tournament that wasn't held there. But the big thing is how can an underrepresented minority suddenly be equated to a single issue? We forget the real people that we are talking about, the lives they have lived, the people and friends they have touched, and suddenly make their entire existence about bathrooms. Why? I'm from Oregon, and as I was doing some of the research that I used to put this presentation together, I started looking at a lot of the laws that were used to harass LGBTQIA folks for many, many years. One of the most interesting laws I found was that in 1928 in Oregon, mutual masturbation was criminal. I'm still not sure who was actually checking this or how they were finding this out. But needless to say, it wasn't until 12 years ago that Oregon passed its first anti-discrimination law. That's important because I was 53 years old then. Ted Kulongoski signed into law the protections that were added to the Oregon Equality Act and finally was put into place January of 2008. But another really good one, because I spent so much of my time in San Francisco and in the California area, was looking at how did California actually treat people? And San Francisco wasn't always the mecca that everybody thinks it is today. This law, published in 1898, which is absolutely amazing, that you couldn't appear in public naked. Okay, I'll buy that. But you could not appear in a dress not belonging to his or her sex, or in indecent or lewd dress. Okay, this law was used by police to harass, most notably, transgender people. They would round up the drag queens, the cross-dressers, the transvestites, and transsexuals. Keep in mind that transgender was not a term used at that time. And yes, I just used many of the worst vernaculars all in one sentence, but they would load them up into paddy wagons and charge them with impersonating a woman. In 1998, California finally published their first gender identity guidelines. Guidelines, mind you, not a law. It wasn't until 2003 that California put in place discrimination protections for sexual identity and gender expression. I was 48 years old then. Why is this important? I'm going to tell you 2 stories that took place on opposite sides of the US. We've all heard about Stonewall in 1969. Well, that was the year that I arrived on the streets of San Francisco as a runaway. I was 14 years old. 2019 was the 50th anniversary of Stonewall. Now, I'm pretty sure most of you know what Stonewall is and what they were famous for, but it is considered to be a pivotal point in LGBTQ history. June 28th, 1969, a police raid took place on the Stonewall Inn in Greenwich Village, in a neighborhood in Manhattan. This was one of the few places where trans people, drag queens, sex workers, male and female, and yes, my intention was to use the biological terms because back then it was very biological. They were able to be themselves. Police routinely raided these bars and would beat and arrest many. Well, it all came to a head on that night in June. The ensuing riots that took place are considered to be the catalyst for the LGBT movement of today. We would not have pride today if it was not for trans women of color throwing bricks at police. The LGBTQ movement started here and continues to this day. We can't stop. We have to be diligent as others try to remove everything that those before us fought so hard to ensure that we have today. Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera are noted for their resistance and for their activist activities. This is important to me because I grew up during these times on the West Coast. The first meal I ever ate in San Francisco was at a small cafeteria named Jim Comptons. It was on the corner of Turk and Taylor. They had decent food, it was cheap, and this was actually to become one of my regular places to hang out and get out of the weather, which was exactly what I needed since the only work that I could do was being a male hustler, which is basically a euphemism for a child sex worker. Considering money was not a luxury I had much of, and I didn't have a place to stay most of the time, this was the place that I would, hang out just to be out of the way. I had never knowingly seen or actually met any drag queens, transvestites, or transsexuals before I ever arrived in San Francisco. When I started coming to this restaurant, I realized how many there actually really were. Comptons was a place where every evening, 8 to 10 p.m., they would all congregate and they would come in, they would have coffee, they would take up all of the window booths, and a few of my friends who were also sex workers and I knew some of these women from working some of the same locations. Well, many of the women were also survival sex workers due to the discrimination they faced in employment. It wasn't long after that I was invited to sit with them and hear the stories that they told about the harassment that they received at the hands of the police. Now, I hadn't personally seen a lot of harassment, but then again, being only 14, I was trying to stay away from the police as much as possible. They told me about a night where they had an actual riot there. I actually had no idea how significant these conversations were at that time until much later in my life. These were the women, trans women of color, white women, sex workers, both men, women, drag queens, the weekend warriors. These were the guys that would, present as male during the week and then come down and present as female on the, Friday, Saturday, Sunday nights. Well, these were the people that took me in, gave me places to stay, made sure I had something to eat when I didn't have money. It didn't matter to them who I was, why I was there. I was just considered a part of their community, part of their family. These are the women who taught me that what I had felt all my life was real, not something to be feared, not anything to be ashamed of, but something that I should actually revel in, and to realize that who I was and to be able to live my best life. These women, this community, they taught me, they actually molded me and molded my feelings and beliefs into the person that I am today. And for that, I am truly grateful. But anyway, enough about me. Let's get on with the story about what took place 3 years before I came to San Francisco. It was the late summer of 1966 in the Tenderloin district of San Francisco. The Comptons Cafeteria, as I said before, was the place where everyone would gather, have a good time, and chat. Everyone in the community was there. It was always an issue, though, with the management at Comptons. They did not like the LGBTQIA crowd at all, and they did everything they could do to discourage them. After management at Comptons had started cracking down on the transgender customers, basically because they felt they were loitering and not spending enough money, they actually instituted a charge, a service fee, and this was directed directly at the trans customers. Well, one night, a group of trans women having a good time got a little bit too loud, and the management, after trying to get them to leave, finally called the police. Well, the police there were really well known for the brutality that they had perpetrated on LGBTQ folks, and this night things were going to change, and they changed forever. One of these known officers attempted to arrest one of the trans women. She wasn't going to have it. She threw her coffee in his face. That started the riot. Tables were dumped, glasses and bricks were thrown at the police. Many of the trans women at that time actually carried bricks in their purses in order to keep people from taking advantage of them out on the street. Well, it spilled out onto the street. Every single pane of glass at Comptons was broken out. It carried on through the night until the police were able to clear the streets. Well, the next day, a protest was arranged with the community, all coming together. Over the night and that day, Comptons had replaced all the glass. Well, that didn't last long. All of the glass was broken out again in the aftermath of a second night of rioting. This marked the beginning of transgender activism in the San Francisco area. According to Susan Stryker, who is a well-known transgender historian and wrote the book Transgender History, right? She actually notes that Compton's Cafeteria riot was the first known incident of collective militant queer resistance to police harassment in U.S. history. Many of the militant hustlers, street queens involved in this riot were actually members of Vanguard. Now, Vanguard was the first known gay youth organization in the United States, which had been organized earlier that year with the help of radical ministers working with the Glide Memorial Methodist Church. This was a center for progressive and social activism in the Tenderloin district for many, many years. In the years following the Comptons riot, services for the transgender community started making an appearance in San Francisco. And this all culminated in the creation of the National Transsexual Counseling Unit. That's the NTCU. This, according to many sources, was originally called the Transsexual Counseling Unit, with services directed to the transgender community in the San Francisco area. However, they've expanded their offerings across the US and changed the name to the NTCU to reflect this. Reed Erickson, who is responsible for much of the funding supporting all of these activities. Well, Reed was the founder of Erickson Educational Foundation. He is an American trans man known for his philanthropy and trans activism all across the US. The EEF was known for supporting organizations such as the Harry Benjamin Foundation and the Johns Hopkins Gender Identity Clinic. The EEF also functioned as an information and counseling resource. This was a referral network of physicians and psychologists and provided informational resources for transgender people and their families. So what has come about in the recent years in San Francisco? Well, a transgender cultural district was established via ordinance from the San Francisco Board of Supervisors in 2017. The first of its kind transgender cultural district was originally known as the Comptons Transgender Cultural District, but as of March of 2020, the name was changed to the Transgender District. The name change was done to avoid unintentionally honoring the transphobic cafeteria owner. It was originally named after the uprising of the transgender and queer people I previously described. This is the first recognized transgender district in the world to date. In July of 2019, the board allocated $300,000 in seed money to support the district and provide jobs and training for local trans people of color. I originally heard about this listening to NPR and started looking for information. I am planning to go back to this museum again, as this place contains so many memories for me. A lot of the information that I presented here can be found or accessed through these sites. I will make this presentation available with all of my speaker notes and citations, allowing you to do your own further discovery of LGBTQIA history on your own. So what should your takeaways be from my talk today? Well, remember, Pride was a protest movement to bring LGBTQ rights to us all. It is not parties, it's not parades, it's not flags, and certainly not corporate slogans. Remember that all people, and I mean everyone, are not about single issues. And keep in mind that everyone has a different journey through life. You may never know what they have endured to get to where they are today. Everyone deserves to be treated with empathy and compassion. And we are all more than our labels. Labels only describe what we choose to expose to those around us. But above all, you need to remember that everyone is more than their pronouns. And the people who fought for us, the women who molded me and whose shoulders I stand on, would want each of us to live our lives with real pride. Thank you, everyone. Great. So I have a couple questions here. The first question was, how do you apologize to someone for misgendering them, especially for the second, third time, and especially when they don't remind you? Well, I tend to not remind people either. When I first started transitioning, I would remind people once or twice, gently. And then after that, if you're somebody that they know and you have apologized once or twice before, just gender them correctly and move on. Because it almost seems disingenuous to keep apologizing. And remember that this is, you're trying to make them comfortable, right? This isn't about you. So your being uncomfortable shouldn't even come into it, right? Use the right pronoun and then just move on. And now a really good question here, and I really like this, is who drove the trans services rollout in San Francisco? Was it trans, allies, or progressive churches? And I said, it's actually a combination of all of the above. The Glide Methodist Church, there were lots of trans activists that were supported through them. The trans man, Reed Erickson, he was actually the financier. I mean, he put out, lots of money to help support these activities. And then, of course, there were lots of allies that helped at that point in time. It's one of the most amazing things that ever took place, because without that, we wouldn't have had the changes that came about in the DSM, which is the guidelines that they always use for determining at that point in time, being LGBT, you were considered to have some sort of mental disorder, and it was due to all of this work that they did early in the 70s and 80s that eventually got all of that removed from being a problem or being considered a mental health issue. So do we have any more questions? Kind of waiting to see here.
I don't see any more. People can always continue to ask questions in the...
I see one. Oh, people are typing. One moment.
Okay, so it looks like we might have a few more. We do have a talk chat for the keynote that people will be hanging out in throughout the event, and so that discussion can continue even as we move on to the next talk.
Okay, so this is really an interesting question. Is there a way to signal that you are a trans ally when you suspect but do not know if someone is transgender? And my question is, why does that, or my question back to you is, why does that matter? It shouldn't matter whether you suspect or not. You just treat them as a person. You treat them as you would want to be treated. There is nothing that your behaviors will signal very, boldly that you are an ally. And here's another really good question. Is there a neutral pronoun we can use? So like if you grew up with someone who is a he, then 20 years later they transition to she, it can take a while for our human brains to switch, and mistakes will always be made. And this is very, very true. One of the big things is that we are creatures of habit. And once we learn something, it's very hard for us to make new connections, and especially when we get really old. And this was one of the things that I have found really interesting in watching people over the years. And that's why I said in my pronoun deal that it kind of breaks along how you were brought up, right? So that depending upon what part of history you've come up in, it's much easier for you. So, I mean, right now, my grandkids, when I came out and transitioned for my third time, had no problem changing pronouns, and they don't make mistakes. And yet my daughters and son did for a while. And then, of course, there was, the people who are, my age and older who just really come unglued about it. So neutral pronouns, that's where they, them is good, right? Which is, basically non-binary, right? Just puts you right in the middle. But there's a whole ton of other ones that I had on that slide, right? That are actually all I couldn't believe how many of them there were when I put that slide together. Waiting to see if we have more questions here. I do want to say that this has actually been a lot of fun, and I did put this together specifically for this conference, and it was fun to go back through and revisit some of the stuff that I did research on and see where it has moved. If you do get a chance, I would definitely suggest reading Susan Stryker's Transgender History, because one of the interesting things about it is it shows the intersection of LGBT rights activism versus trans activism, and how at certain points in history they were at odds with each other, including trans feminism. So it's one of those really great things to get out and just read that book and see all of the things that went on to get to where we are today. Okay, I'm all good. I will be over in the Top Chat keynote for a while so that Kitty can get on with the next speaker. Thanks, everybody. I've really had a lot of fun. Hope you have a lot of fun at the con today. Bye.